Hello, and welcome to a lecture on language migrations and traditions from 600 to 1450. We're going to start discussing language in regards to the way that linguists classify languages. So your base language is called your language family. This is where they're all related through some type of ancestral language that existed long before recorded history. There's only a couple of language families out there. Indo-European is going to be your largest. Your language branch is coming off of the family, and this is kind of your next subgroup associated with your family. And then your group is where we get super specific on the language that people are speaking. Here you can see the Indo-European language family. So linguists have dated Proto-Indo-European language back to about 5000 BCE. They do this through looking at things associated with farming or technology or environment. Those three factors are very important in understanding the origins and the hearth of a language. So when you see a word for grass, and that word is the same throughout all the different families, then they're all related to this Proto-Indo-European language. So our one of our most spoken Indo-European language branches comes from the Romans. Obviously, this is your Latin base for all of your Romance languages, your French, your Spanish, your Italian. Something interesting to note out of the Roman language families is the Romanish and the Romanish. Those two languages we're going to see in Eastern European areas, and they're going to become important through World War I. Our next largest is going to be your Germanic families. We've been talking about the Germanic tribes and all the different Germanic groups. So anything really in Central Europe is going to be considered a Germanic language. However, with the spread of English, we also get other forms like Afrikaans. Afrikaans is this Dutch, English, African mix that you find down in South Africa. You can see all of our Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, those languages are part of the Germanic as well. So a lot of people feel that the Vikings probably spoke more of a Germanic language rather than the Baltic Slavic. So if you look at the Baltic Slavic language family, you can see Lithuanian and Latvian as your language groups, as well as Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Czech, and then Bulgarian. The Russian obviously is going to have a little bit of Germanic in there because of the Viking mix within the Russo-Slavic switch over right before the Mongols. The Ukrainian, Polish, and Czech, these languages are super important in regards to things like World War II, and we will talk about that again. You'll be reading in class an article about how English being a Germanic base rather than French, the French language sticking on the islands, and you'll see that in a class activity. Your Celtic languages are obviously going to be those territories of the British Isle that the Romans were not in control of. So Welsh is going to be able to maintain its existence, as well as the Irish Gaelic and then your Scottish Gaelic. Those languages have become super important recently as they are kind of revitalizing in regards to kind of cultural restoration and a little bit of cultural preservation. Then you have these other three Indo-European families that are branches that don't have groups. So like Armenian, Greek, and Albanian. The Armenian issue is going to come in with the Armenian genocide, which we'll talk about when we get to World War I. Obviously, Greek is very different than our Latin Romance base, and the Greeks are going to actually kind of adopt more of a Cyrillic writing rather than the Roman writing system, or really the Phoenician writing system. And then the Albanian language group is also going to be important in regards to the breakup of Yugoslavia. The graph on the left of this slide is showing you the different language groups, different language families, and how many people in the world speak them. Obviously, 45% of the world speaks an Indo-European base. You can see our Sino-Tibetan is going to be our next largest, which makes sense because there's so many people who are Chinese. From there on out, it gets very dramatically small. So only 6% speaks Altaic, or only 6% speaks Niger-Congo. So obviously the world's dominant languages are either part of the Indo-European family or the Sino-Tibetan family. Here you can see just kind of a map of where the distribution of Indo-European is. You can see a lot of the Russian territory, and then of course some of the Middle Eastern regions as well. Arabic is the Indo-European Aryans are what kind of create this Indo-European speaking throughout the Middle East, and then Arabic comes in, which is we'll discuss in another slide. And then of course you can see the migration across the Atlantic with the English and of course the Spanish and Portuguese. Your Sino-Tibetan is your next largest spoken language, and you can see Chinese is going to be your largest as in regards to that. Chinese is actually very different from the Tibetan-Burman language groups. The Chinese also, you have a couple forms of Chinese as well with Mandarin Chinese and Cantonese. You can see for the Tibetan-Burman language groups the different types there. So the language that is spoken down in Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam is going to be very different than what we're seeing in northeastern India or in the Himalaya mountains. So the Sino-Burman language groups are going to not be as exposed to trade as some of the rest of China and some of the rest of the other languages that we've seen in the Asian areas. Here's your map of Africa in regards to the different language groups. One of the biggest impacts on the Niger-Congo B, which is a Bantu base, is because of the Bantu migrations, which we'll talk about. The Afro-Asiatic, the blue that you see there, is another language family that is Arabic. So that's where we get our Arabic base. And then, of course, you have your Niger-Congo A. You can see where the Sahara Desert is going to have a huge impact on what language is spoken where. And then you have the Kosean language family, which is actually the African languages with the clicking sounds. The Madagascar language is an Austro-Asian language, which is coming out of the Polynesian area. So when the Polynesians migrate out, you're going to see Madagascar is going to obviously be more of a Austro-Asian rather than an African language. One of the most significant migrations throughout this first couple units for AP World History is the Turks. You can see all of the movement of these Turkish people. The Turks are a nomadic group of people, so it would make sense that they're kind of constantly moving. You can see that our Proto-Turkish people are really literally in the center. Modern day in our Stan areas is really where you're going to find a lot of your Turks. The Turks are going to speak basically this Indo-Iranian language that is part of the Indo-European language. So they're going to pick up on a little bit of the Indo-European language. So when we talk about the Xiongnu, they're actually Turkish. Or we talk about the Uyghurs, they're Turkic. Or, the Ottoman Turks are obviously going to be an important group of people. We've already mentioned the Seljuk Turks within the Middle East as well. The Uzbeks today, Uzbekistan, are a Turkish group. The Kyrgyzstan is another area of Turkish. So you can see that the Turks are going to, because they're nomads and because they're horse riders, you're going to see a huge amount of movement amongst the Turks. And the Turks ultimately gain political power in a lot of territories. So within the Middle East, they become the sultans. The Tang dynasty is actually a Turkish ethnic group. So we'll see the Turks, and then of course the Ottoman Turks are going to be in charge for a really long time. So the Turkish people group kind of do settle down and actually gain quite a lot of political power throughout the course. The green territory you can see where we actually have some arable land. Arable meaning farmable. Farmable is not a word. So the green territory is all that you can actually farm. So you can see that what the Turks were doing was resource seeking. They kept moving in order to try to create a stable food supply, stable resources. And you can see once the Ottoman Turks get into modern day Turkey, that obviously it would make sense that they were going into that region because it is resource rich, which we've talked about repeatedly. The Bantu migrations in Africa are significant in regards to creating the spread of iron, yams, and bananas. Believe it or not, yams and bananas are super important to the diet, and one of the things that, because of the Bantu migrations, one of the biggest deals about moving those products is that we get a replacement for a nutrient that was possibly missing from the diet. And getting that nutrient into the African diet, into the sub-Saharan African diet, actually increases the populations down there. And so as we increase the population, we're going to get more organized political systems because the resources become more scarce, and use of those resources have to be controlled a little bit better. So really, without the Bantu migration, we would have had no political organization in sub-Saharan Africa at all. And of course, the use of iron in regards to farming is very important. Iron implements makes it much easier to produce agriculturally, and of course, iron in regards to warfare will help in regards to controlling the resources. What the Bantu did when they migrated is they actually acculturated the people that they encountered. Acculturation means that you kind of absorb the culture. So the people that they encountered took a little bit of the Bantu culture, as well as the Bantu taking a little bit of what they encountered. So you can see the three different waves. They come out of the Cameroon Mountains and go down into along the Congo River, which of course following their water resource, and they lived in a village type system. And then the rainforest movement, because there's a limit in regards to arable land and rainforests, they're going to move further south. And then the grasslands on the other side of the Kalahari Desert are going to provide grazing for their cattle, because the Bantu are pastoralists, they are cattle farmers. And so again, it's all about resources and trying to find those resources. Another people group that we need to look at in North Africa are these people that we call the Berbers. This is an ancient African culture group. They were pre-Arab, and there's about 300 different dialects. Dialects is actually so you have family as your base, your branch, and then your group, and then dialects is a specific form of that group. So you have, in regards to like Cockney English versus the Queen's English, or in the United States, Southern versus Northern forms of American English. So you have about 300 different forms of dialects. They're non-Semitic speakers, so they are speaking a base out of the African language rather than a Semitic language coming out of the Middle East. There's no written language for the Berbers, and there's no formalized education, which means that our understanding of the Berbers in regards to their history is very limited. The information we have about the Berbers is going to come from the Arabs for the most part. They were pretty much nomadic pastoralists, and they worked in camels, and so of course that's going to be important to trans-Saharan trade. They usually hung out in desert or mountain regions because of the Arab invasions. Once the Arabs started to come into North Africa, the Berbers kind of isolated themselves into land that nobody would want. And camels are going to be able to survive in those regions, which obviously would mean make their most what they're going to use for their product, as well as far as making money and as far as trading. Ultimately, in the 10th century, we have a group of people out of Egypt called the Fatimids. The Fatimids were a Egyptian Arab culture group that's going to come out of Egypt and basically try to Arabize or Arabization process for all of the Berber groups, or Islamization of all of the Berber groups. Domestication and trade of the camels is what's going to spread Islam throughout North Africa, so this Arabization of the Berbers is going to assist in making North Africa very Arabic and very Muslim in regards to its culture. So you can see today that there's different Berbers throughout different countries in North Africa, and you see the different countries and how many people are speaking in each of the individual countries. So obviously very few in Egypt, very few in Tunisia. We're going to have our largest amount of Berbers are going to be in Morocco, which actually makes sense. Morocco is very European because the Spanish controlled it for quite some time. And so there's they fit a little bit more culturally within that area than they do the other parts of North Africa. So North Africa today is very Arab and Muslim, whereas Sub-Saharan Africa is going to be very Bantu and very African. Another important migrant group are the Vikings. You guys have obviously been exposed to them previously. They're an Old Norse culture group, and they have their own religion. Thor comes from the Vikings. Odin, a couple other guys that you may have heard of, and they developed this ship, the longboat, that's able to sail up rivers and estuaries. And because of a lack of resources in the 790s to 1066, and because of this fall of Rome and this power vacuum, the Vikings did a lot of raiding. They would go to these little villages, these urban centers that were still in place post Roman Empire fall, and they would kind of take over. However, the history of the Vikings comes from the Western Europeans. It comes from the Roman speakers. So it's very difficult to know exactly what the Vikings were doing. Charlemagne actually had this huge program of trying to Christianize them. And part of the issue was that perhaps they were trying to avoid that Christianization. And as a result, they became resource poor and they ended up kind of nomadic. Not necessarily by choice, but to avoid Christianization. Some people feel that perhaps what the Vikings were doing was because there was no centralized government. So they were resource seekers and they took what they wanted in regards to these different areas. And then this decline in trade, obviously, that results from the fall of Rome is going to be a resource issue. What it does as far as affecting Europe, it actually increases centralization in Western Europe. What ends up happening is part of the issue with the feudal system was protection. What were people seeking protection from? Part of that was the Vikings. People were fearful of the Vikings, and so they ended up centralizing and actually kind of causing a little bit more of that feudal system to develop and to become more centralized through the end of the early Middle Ages and into the High Middle Ages. Eric the Red is a Viking who definitely got to the Americas. We have archaeological evidence that the Vikings were over here. Now we're talking super north, like Newfoundland, not down into what we call the United States today, but definitely into those territories near like Greenland and all that. And like I said, their history is unclear, so we're not totally sure in regards to anything except for we do know that they definitely combined to make the Rus culture. We do know that they were a warrior people because of the archaeological evidence left behind. A lot of the archaeological evidence we have of the Vikings are warlike in nature. And again, you'll be reading an article about that in class. Another migration that's super important is the Polynesian migrations. We will look at this a little bit more detail in the next unit as Captain James Cook is going to start looking at these islands. So around 3000 to 1000 BCE, these Austronesian speakers, the Austronesian is a language family, spread throughout the islands of Southeast Asia, which creates this unique culture that we call the Polynesian culture. So this is a culture of Trinidad or of Samoa. Disney, of course, is releasing a new movie about this culture. And you can see kind of in the map where they were going throughout the different island groups. How we know that they are all Polynesian is that they have the same words for a lot of tools, plants, and animals. And one of the things that they did was moved a lot of plants that were indigenous to Asia, really Taiwan, out through these different Polynesian islands. Obviously, Hawaii is probably the most known to you in regards to Polynesian culture. Hawaiian, the language Hawaiian, is an Austronesian base, and Hawaii is the only state in the United States that actually has two official languages, English and Hawaiian. As far as traditions for this time period, we have to look at the spread of Christianity and Buddhism in detail. Obviously, we looked at the spread of Islam in regards to the Islam and Politics lecture and Islam as a religion lecture. So one of the reasons why Christianity is going to spread so much into Western Europe and obviously into Russia is because the influence of the church. The Catholic Church is going to be heavily involved in politics throughout the High Middle Ages. It's very significant, the crowning of Charlemagne, and it was done on December 25th in the year 800. And then you have all those controversies between the kings and the papacy. And ultimately, for this time period, the church wins. In the next time period, we will see the kings becoming a little bit more aggressive against the Catholic Church, but for this unit, the church is going to win, and the church is more powerful than the kings. One of the things is the ending of pagan traditions. How they did that was actually turning monks into special missionary figures throughout all of Europe, and so this is where the Catholic Church is going to start doing things like incorporating some of the pagan beliefs into Christian holidays and into Christian systems. So like Easter is actually the pagan holiday about Oster. Oster is a fertility goddess, so that's where the eggs come from for Easter. Also, the December 25th is Dionysus's birthday, which is the god of wine. So it was one of the most celebrated pagan holidays, so it would make sense that the Catholic Church would change that to be Christmas. This is also one of the things that they do for Christianity, is creating this idea of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is in most religions. And so what they did was they created these holy relics. So they would say, the head of John the Baptist was in Constantinople, or the finger of Saint whoever was in this city. And the idea was that if you would go to kind of worship at these sites, then you could receive freedom from an illness or a certain sin that you were struggling with or something like that. A pilgrimage was the ultimate sacrifice, which ultimately will create the Crusades. It's one of the justifications for the Crusades. The Christian Church, both the Orthodox and the Catholics, said that the Arab Muslims were attacking the Christian pilgrimages on their way to the Holy Land to go see the relics associated with Jesus' life and death, and so that is partly where the Crusades come to play. The monasteries are super important to Europe during this time period. They're doing all of the record keeping. That's where you would register your kid's birth. That's where you would register your marriage. Also, all of the feudal contracts were filed with the monasteries. There wasn't necessarily, because again, the church was really in charge of politics at this point, there wasn't really a separation there. So anytime you had a document that was super important, you would, especially as a lord or a king, you would file a copy with the monasteries. The monasteries is where all education took place. Obviously, most of that education is going to be based in Christianity. Now, that's not to say that everybody was learning to speak Latin. The church maintains that lay people who are not necessarily within the church as priests or bishops or higher up, are not to read the Bible directly. And so the Bible will remain translated in Latin until the next era. So we will talk about that impact a little bit later. And then, of course, the monasteries would offer protection. Anytime there was any type of fighting or anything like that, they would go into these monasteries because they were holy grounds. And so that idea that, God would protect you in times of strife and struggle when the Vikings were coming and the Mongols were coming was super important in regards to the spread of Christianity as well. A lot of times people would go to the monasteries for help in times of starvation or famine. The monasteries had their own lands. They were farmers for the most part. I think I mentioned this before. A lot of your monasteries would find something to produce in regards to a trade, whether that be beer. A lot of monasteries are producing textiles or things of that nature. The monasteries, in regards to going back to the education, this is the only people who could read and write were in the monasteries. And so they were the ones that were maintaining a lot of the stories of the literature of the Middle Ages, which is limited. The literature of the Middle Ages is limited, but if there were any of the illuminated manuscripts, these books that were hand copied, were going to be in the monasteries. The spread of Buddhism obviously is going to be revitalized with the Pax Mongolica. The peace that comes in with the Mongols, ironically, is going to allow for the spread of Buddhism. Most of this Buddhism that spread is the Mahayana form. Part of that is because this Bodhisattvas concept. The Bodhisattvas is considered to be teachers who have reached enlightenment, but instead of going to nirvana, they sacrifice and come back in the form of teachers or gurus of some type to teach the people how they themselves can reach nirvana. in this case, what ends up happening is people are able to take their local gods and goddesses and make them Bodhisattvas. So, for example, a Buddhist in the middle of China would probably actually consider Jesus to be a Bodhisattva. And so that idea of these people coming back to earth to reteach and continue to teach how to get to nirvana allows for local gods and goddesses to remain in place. So Buddhism doesn't threaten the existing belief systems as it spread throughout the different territories of Asia. Pilgrimages is super important as well in Buddhism. We will see pilgrimages from the Chinese into India to look and see the different sacred sites associated with Buddhism. The Bodhi tree that he sat under is a sacred site, and to kind of go to the original place of the founding of Buddhism is just as important to Buddhists as going to Jerusalem was for Christians during this time period. Another thing that helps Buddhism spread is there's no organized religion. All of the religions are super local. Again, remember that the philosophies used by the Chinese dynasties are secular in nature. There's not one big organized belief system, so it's going to make it easy for Buddhism to spread because of that as well. The Buddhists are also going to develop monasteries, much like the Christians. The monasteries are going to serve many of the same purposes that the Christian monasteries did, maintaining education, maintaining a place for protection, maintaining a way to separate yourself out from society. The monasteries are going to be a problem under the Tang Emperor Wuzong because of the amount of land and money that the monasteries were taking away from the Tang government. Every time the monasteries would be established and they would expand, they were taking farmland, and only 10%, 11% of China today is arable land. So you can imagine what it was like during the Tang Dynasty as well. So a lot of the usually times of unrest are associated with a lack of resources, and so the Tang Emperor was looking for someone to blame, and he definitely is going to blame the Buddhist monasteries. The Song are going to be more acceptant of Buddhism, and then of course the Mongols were very accepting of all different forms of belief systems, and so Buddhism is actually going to survive this kind of Tang issue. The Zen form of Buddhism is also going to kind of come into this area with both Japan and China, and their emphasis is on meditation to reach enlightenment. So Zen Buddhism, again, works with things like Taoism that's already in place, the idea of being one with nature, the idea of being in sync with nature is going to fit. So Buddhism really just fits into the Asian belief systems that were already there. We do have Theravada Buddhism spreading into Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka today still practices Theravada Buddhism. Sri Lanka is a separate country now. It's no longer part of India. And then, of course, your Southeast Asia is going to be more Theravada simply because of this trade that was going on between the island groups. Also, territories in Tibet are going to kind of create their own form of Buddhism. And again, there's not really, Mahayana form of Buddhism is a variety of different types of ways that is practiced, but there isn't anything in regards to religious wars or religious warfare or anything like that within this Buddhist system. It's very different from Christianity. Neo-Confucianism is a revitalization of secular belief systems under the Tang. The Song and the Ming dynasties are going to continue on with the Neo-Confucian tradition. Basically, with the proliferation of Buddhism into Asia, Confucianism became a little bit more religious. Confucianism at its base is meant to be a philosophy, not necessarily a religion. Confucius was considered a Bodhisattva by the Buddhists, and so it kind of made sense that would happen. Neo-Confucianism is a reaction to that. Neo just means new. So the idea is that you can create peace and stability through metaphysics. So you can create a peaceful existence through philosophy and thinking and science rather than religion. There's all kinds of different forms of Neo-Confucianism. So the whole point is it's emphasizing rational thought. Reason and logic is the base of Neo-Confucianism. This Neo-Confucianism is going to spread into Korea and Japan, and basically we end up with very pragmatic ways of ruling. Pragmatic means like practical. So instead of taking, God into consideration, or even a mandate of heaven or anything like that, is 100% based off of logic. So you can compare Neo-Confucianisms to the Greeks, to the early Roman Senate and the development of democracy there, and this pragmatic way of ruling that discounts religion completely will influence the rise of communism later in Asia. During this time period, we get a lot of new science and technology, especially in regards to math. This is going to be based out of the Muslims. The Muslims are going to take these Hindu Arabic numerals rather than Roman numerals, and they're actually easier to work with. So obviously you guys don't know Roman numerals because they're not easy to work with, so it makes sense that they're going to start using these Arabic numerals, which is what we use today. The House of Wisdom was basically kind of a library that was developed in Baghdad in the 8th century. And in the House of Wisdom, all of the Greco-Roman classics were stored and translated into Arabic. And as a result of that, Euclid, geometry, or any of the stuff, the Aristophanes, and any of that stuff that the Greeks developed kind of gets saved and gets restudied and revitalized through the Muslim caliphates. We have the Muhammad al-Khwarizmi, I apologize, was a director in the 9th century. And he's actually going to create algebra. One of the important aspects is the concept of zero. The concept of zero is actually going to come out of India, and the Arabs are going to use it in order to create things like algebra, which is going to bleed into the creation of geometry. In Islam, you're not allowed to artistically depict the human form, and so they use geometric shapes in their art and architecture, and obviously that geometric shapes is really important mathematically in regards to creating the mosaics and things like that that are decorating things like the Dome of the Rock. Nasser al-Din al-Tusi is going to be the one who starts studying the concept of the sine function. The sine function originated in India and comes into the Arab areas, and that's going to create the development of trigonometry. So you can blame your pre-calc class and calculus class on all of these people. The Greek science will return to Europe. The Al-Andalus is basically the Muslim empire, Muslim caliphate in Spain. And so they are going to kind of preserve a lot of the Greek and Roman traditions as well. And so that's going to be partly why the Spanish are going to be so successful at exploration. They're a little bit more open to science and technology because of what was preserved in Granada through the Muslim caliphate that was there. Printing is also super important during this time period. Paper coming out of China is going to be imperative to the changing of government and the changing of document and record keeping. So we could not have those written records or those written contracts between the feudal lords if paper had not spread out of China. Buddhism and Christianity is going to encourage printing books. Now this is hand printing. We are not doing the movable type printing that is in China at this point. The Gutenberg printing press is going to be in the next time period, but the hand printed books are going to, again, the monasteries are pretty much the ones who are doing that. Movable type is used during the Song dynasty. And obviously we lose that technology a little bit with the attack of the Mongols. And the Europeans, again, are not going to develop that movable type until the next time period.